What's up, guys, and welcome back to Moan Inc. If you guys are new here, then what's up? My name's Erica. Heya, how you doing? For today's video, I am bringing on a guest that I've had on before, but this time we're discussing something different with a different context. So the guest, as you guys can see from the title, is the incredible Professor Paul Cartledge of Cambridge University. And last time he was on the channel, about a month ago, we spoke specifically about Sparta, about the intricacies, the misconceptions, misunderstandings of the ancient polis, the religion, all of this sort of stuff. We really had an in-depth conversation where I just questioned the crap out of Professor Cartledge. However, today we are shifting gears slightly and looking at a different polis, and that is, as you can see, Thebes. Now, Thebes for me is a bit of... It's not the easiest polis for me. It's one that, as I've explained on the channel before, I have certainly struggled to understand and struggled to really get into due to lack of source material and all of that sort of stuff. So I've already spoken to Professor James Romm about specifically the Sacred Band, which was a standing army of ancient Thebes. But today, Professor Cartledge and I are going to be doing more so an overview of ancient Thebes. We're going to be going into the religion, the mythology, some military escapades, but sort of looking at a sort of broader brushstroke of the city. So first and foremost, thank you, Professor Cartledge, for sitting down with me a second time. I feel so lucky, so thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
So my first question about Thebes, to sort of start us off, was to ask you what the appeal of ancient Thebes was for you in order to write this book, and also to just, sort of cling on to and find interest in. Because I think from the outside in, Thebes looks like it is so rich in so much, like when it comes to, the mythology, lyric poetry specifically, religion, practice, all of this sort of thing. There's so much going on in Thebes. Like, objectively, there's so much going on. And yet the source material is so minimal. So what was it that really pulled you into the study of Thebes that made you want to explore it further?
There are four main cities or political entities which dominate the ancient Greek classical archaic scene. And Sparta we've talked about, Athens I've mentioned. The third is Macedon, from where Philip of Macedon and his son Alexander, later Alexander the Great, come. And Macedon comes to dominate the whole of the mainland, and then through the successors of Alexander, Greek culture, Greek power spreads throughout the Middle East as far as Pakistan and India, Afghanistan. And quite extraordinary in the centuries after Alexander's death at the end of the 4th century. But before Alexander died, indeed before he went out to Asia, in order to make the point that you Greeks are my subjects, including Athens, including Sparta, and you better not rebel against me or else, he ordered the total annihilation, with one exception really, of the city of Thebes. So one knew about that. And then you wondered, well, how come Thebes was so important at that time, whereas thinking back previously, it hadn't been? And then when you get into why Alexander claimed to have destroyed Thebes and why he claimed he was going to take on the Persian Empire, Thebes is center of the story, because Thebes, when the Persians had invaded, this is Xerxes in 480 BC, following the Battle of Marathon 490, Xerxes, great emperor, huge, powerful, massive invasion force, aiming obviously to conquer and subjugate all mainland Greece, as well as the islands, as well as the Greeks of Asia, whom he already ruled. One of the cities which decided to side with him, as opposed to joining the resistance led by Athens and Sparta, was Thebes. Now, there are reasons, in other words, one can put forward extenuating circumstances why they, in effect, betrayed Greece, why they turned traitor and went over to the Persians. The Greeks had a word for it, Medizing. If you take the sides of the Persians against Greeks, you Medize, because one name the Greeks gave to the Persians is quite wrong, but nevertheless they called them Medes. So in 484-79, Thebes actually becomes the base of the Persian invasion of mainland Greece against the resisting Greeks. And so Alexander, following Philip, said, well, you know why we're going to attack the Persian Empire? Revenge for the betrayal of Thebes and other Greek cities. Many actually were on the Persian side at the beginning of the 5th century BC. And then I thought, and this is sort of, one wants to do justice to a culture. Greece has about 1,000 different cities. So I thought, why do we just study things from the point of view of two of them, that is Sparta and then Athens, followed by Macedon? Why don't we talk about cities in between those great powers, allied to one or other, enemy of one or other, but important in their own right? So Thebes is the obvious third Greek city, apart from Macedon, after Athens and Sparta. Then, and this is, of course, I've got a particular interest in Greek, that is mainly Athenian drama, mainly tragedy, but also comedy. And so the myths of the Athenian stage, they're very diverse. And of course, we've only got a very tiny selection of the plays that were actually put on, surviving as text. So, for example, Sophocles is credited with something like 120, both tragedies and satyr dramas. How many have we got? 7 tragedies and a bit, quite a substantial bit of one satyr drama. And of those 7, my goodness, 3 of them are what are called Sophocles' Theban plays. But nevertheless, what is it about Thebes, Antigone, Sophocles, Athens that still appeals? So what struck me was, on the one hand, the dissonance between Thebes is the source of some of the most amazing creations in art, in drama, in music, in, well, painting. You go on and on and on. And so I got into what's called the reception of Thebes. So what I'm trying to do is to do justice, or some sort of retributive, restorative justice, to a city which, because it was the enemy of Athens, and at some points the enemy of Sparta, typically gets a very bad press. In other words, negative, so traitor in the Persian Wars, and then there are other ways in which you can have a go at Thebes. And the Athenians, being very sophisticated, snooty, snotty, and looking down their noses, said, the Thebans, they're pigs. And what's meant by that was that they're much more interested in what goes into their stomachs than what goes on in their minds. And that's a little bit unfair, because then I thought, hey, what about? And then, you get into it. There are Theban philosophers, there are Theban poets, there are Theban musicians, most of them not even known to the average general reader of a book like my own. And so what I'm trying to do is, actually, I missed out quite a lot, inevitably, is, as I say, put back in to give a more rounded picture of archaic, classical, and to some extent Hellenistic ancient history, but more particularly to do some justice to the modern reception since the Renaissance, in particular since the 18th century, really, of Theban things which are not typically credited to the Thebans.
Okay, there is so much to unpack with that answer, but I guess the place I want to start with is Alexander the Great coming down and devastating Thebes, because, that in of itself, I think, looking historically and mythologically, I guess, is a really interesting move on his part, because, the Macedonians, they claimed their Greekness through the Thebans, through Heracles, who is obviously Theban. So they destroyed. Alexander the Great comes down and destroys their claim to Greekness, gets rid of it. And also he does that by then leaving one thing, which is really fascinating, that he then decides all of this city can go aside from Pindar's house, which is like the funnest fact from this whole book, in my opinion, from just the whole of Thebes. The idea that Alexander the Great decided to come down, devastate the entire place, enslave all the people, kill a lot of the people, and then say, oh, but not Pindar's house.
Yeah, well, there are two reasons. One is that Pindar was the poet of Hellenism at the time of the Persian War. So he was born in the late 6th century and he lived to the middle of the 5th century. And so he lived through that period. There are some of us who wonder what his own personal political outlook was, because he was prepared to to write compositions which would be sung, a whole range of commissioners, some of whom were tyrants, some in Sicily, and some of whom were, shall we say, right wing as opposed to Democrats. And so one wonders, is Pindar really some sort of pro-aristocrat, pro-oligarch, and therefore in line with the regime which ruled Thebes at the time of the Persian invasion in the early 5th century, which was oligarchic, which was right-wing, which was anti-democratic, which was one reason that the Athenians were on the opposite side. They were fighting the Persians to defend their democracy, which was still very new. And so it was, as we always think now, suppose the Persians had won, would democracy in general have been wiped out? There would have been a period of occupation. Athens' democracy, of course, would have gone. Would that have affected the cultural productions that depend to some degree on Athens being a democracy, above all the theatre? So would we not have had Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and so on? So it goes and so on. But to go down to the time of Alexander the Great, you very correctly put your finger on the contradiction that Heracles is a Theban. Heracles is also one of the ancestors of the Macedonian royal house, as he was, of course, of the Spartan royal houses. So there's a sort of contradiction of, but one thing that you omitted was not just the house of Pindar was spared, but all religious sanctuaries. Now, Alexander was, we would say, superstitious. He was monumentally religious. And so one of his concerns throughout his life was to acquire divine supporters, to reinforce his connections with the existing divine supporters and ancestors, but to acquire new ones. And the most famous one is Ammon in what's today Libya, Western Desert of Egypt, which has an oracle, and Ammon is Egyptian Amun. It's the way the Greeks spelled Amun, it's Ammon. So Alexander goes to his shrine and has a little chat with the priest, and we don't know exactly what was said between them, but that's now a new god for Alexander to worship and to call in aid when necessary. So Alexander caused to be spared the shrine. And as you say, Heracles was the beneficiary of, I think it's 2, but at least 1 major temple and shrine in Thebes. So that was not destroyed. But why did he take such an attitude at all? In other words, why wipe out a city? Thebes ceased to exist for some 20 years. Well, look back a bit. His dad, as Philip was expanding Macedonian power in North Greece, before he comes south and conquers Athens and Thebes, one of the cities that he's up against on his immediate borders is Olynthus. Olynthus was the capital city of a federation, the Chalcidian League, we call it. And it was quite well developed and prosperous, etc. So in 348 BC, Philip obliterated it. And so to such an extent that it's never been reoccupied. So 348 BC, that's it. unlike Thebes, people didn't go back and live there. And so when the archaeologists, American, 1930s, went to it, they found the city as it had been in 348 BC. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. So some of our best evidence for what a Greek house was like, domestic architecture, domestic equipment in the middle of the 4th century from Olynthus, because it was a ghost town, completely destroyed. So why did Philip do that? A warning. If you resist me, I'm going to wipe you out. And so, come over to me rather than resist me. Well, the Thebans in 338, they were a democracy. Now, there's an awful lot's happened between 480, 479 and 338. But in much of the 4th century, Thebes has become a kind of democracy. In 340, having been an enemy of Athens far more often than it had been a friend of Athens, thanks to Demosthenes of Athens, Thebes is persuaded to join in alliance with Athens. They fight a big battle in 338, which Philip wins, total conquest. And Philip doesn't destroy Thebes, but what he does is he places a garrison there. He replaces the regime, so it ceases to be a democracy. It becomes a pro-Philip oligarchy. And the point is divide and rule. He's quite nice to Athens. He leaves its democracy, no garrison, but divides Athens and Thebes, which is the whole way of weakening any central Greek resistance. Why then did Alexander go one step further? Because in 335, thinking that Alexander, who by now was king because Philip was assassinated in 336, why did the Thebans rise up in 335, which the Athenians, by the way, didn't? They heard a rumor that Alexander, way up north, near the Danube, had been killed in battle, and lots of Macedonian kings got killed in battle. For example, Philip's older brother had been killed in the 350s. So it was quite a plausible rumor. Mistake. Alexander did a forced march, and he was in front of the walls of Thebes, which are very substantial. Famous 7 gates of Thebes, big walls, huge acropolis. Thebes is very well defended. He is in front of the walls within 2 weeks, so about 12 days, he covers 500 kilometers, 300 miles, forced marches. And then he's got his army there, he's got his allies. He's succeeded Philip as leader of the Greeks. There's an alliance which just called themselves the Greeks, and the aim of their alliance was to take on Persia eventually. So what's happening is Alexander's marking time. He's making sure that when he goes over to Asia, there won't be any uprising. Greece will be stable. It will be in pro-Macedonian hands, or in the case of Athens, so weakened because Alexander takes lots and lots of Athens' ships, which makes it impossible for them to use the ships against him. And so this is in the interim period that Thebes rises up and gets smashed. And then the next year, 334, Alexander takes off to Asia. But there is a cost, which is that you're destroying a major Greek city when you're about to lead a campaign of Greekness against the Persians.
Something that you've been discussing sort of on and off in that answer is this whole thing of Thebes taking the side of Persia during the Persian Wars, and you sort of touched on it in the previous answer as well. And this is kind of mind-boggling to a lot of people who might not understand the idea of polises in ancient Greece as well, and how they, like Thebes being so close to Athens, actually being a stone throw away, was still like, actually, we're not going to do this. And you mentioned how they did fight alongside them at Thermopylae, which I think is really interesting. There were 400 Thebans, if I'm not mistaken, that were at Thermopylae with them. And something that you also touched on in the book was that these could have possibly been rebels. You know, we don't know why they were there. So was the purpose of Thebes sort of abandoning, and I use that in inverted commas, but like abandoning the Greeks just because they saw it as like a doomed thing? Do we know that, if they were never on the side of the Greeks and those 400 were definitely rebels? Or was it a case of they initially sided with the Greeks and then tapped out in the middle of Thermopylae and just said, this is a suicide mission?
Well, the answer to quite a few of that was quite a multiple question is we don't know. But I think myself into the minds of the ruling regime of Thebes, which sees that to the north of it, so Boeotia is central Greece. Thebes is about 90 kilometers, 55 odd miles from Athens as the crow flies. So it's quite near. But Thebes is, if you like, an appendage of the north as much as it is a central Greek area. And so everything to the north, with just one exception, had, and I used the word earlier, Medi. So Xerxes prepares his expedition for many years, starting in about 485. So Greeks have 4 to 5 years notice that there's going to be this massive invasion. And so they have to decide, resist or go over to the Persians or try to be neutral. Well, Argos, which is Sparta's main enemy in the Peloponnese, Sparta is a fundamentally Peloponnesian power way down south in mainland Greece, but always Argos in the northeast of the Peloponnese resented the fact that Sparta was number one and it wanted to be number one. So Argos said, look, we're not going to take either side. The main historian of that period of Greek history, the Persian invasion, the Persian Wars, Herodotus, says, well, they may well have said that they were going to be neutral. De facto, that meant they were on the Persian side. Now, that's a very harsh sort of line to take, because I think most Greek cities, apart from the handful that agreed to resist, would have expected the Persians to win and to simply steamroller down and through to occupy first mainland Greece down to the Isthmus of Corinth, and then the Peloponnese south of the Isthmus of Corinth, where Sparta and Argos are. They would have expected that. And that's actually what the northern Greek area, mainly Thessaly, but also Marlis and Ypres. There are whole loads of regions, Doris, up there in the north. Why did they so quickly go over to the Persians? Because, now this is not widely known, before Xerxes invaded, actually a good chunk of northern Greece, what we would call Macedonia today, plus parts of Bulgaria, Thrace, were already in the Persian Empire. So the Persian Empire extended to the borders of Thessaly through Macedon, which was part of the Persian Empire. We have to remember that at the time of the Persian Wars, Macedon was already in the Persian Empire when the Persians invaded. So if Thessaly goes over to the Macedonians, then, oh my goodness, if you're Theban, Boeotian, your borders are already Persian. So that's the extenuating circumstance. The Theban rulers gambled, calculated that they were going to lose if they resisted. So why resist? And since their neighbors had already gone over, well, just join the crowd. However, there is another factor, and this is brought out not in Herodotus, but in Thucydides, that actually the ruling elite of Thebes wanted to be in the Persian orbit, because then the Persians would prop them up. They wouldn't overthrow them. If they didn't resist, if they went over to the Persians would simply rubber stamp, keep in power them, because Persians not keen on democracy, you can imagine, because much more difficult to control a democracy, much easier to control a handful of your loyal supporters. And so I think that's the other dimension. On one plane, it is geopolitical. On the other, it is ideological. And for both those reasons, I think it's not surprising, or it's not completely astonishing that Thebes joined the Persians. However, how come then there were 400, that's quite a large number, of hoplites, heavy infantry, so relatively wealthy Thebans, not poor Thebans, fighting with Leonidas and the Spartans and other allies, the local Phocians and some others, against Xerxes, especially, as you say, in the pass of Thermopylae? Well, now there are two views. One is they were volunteers, that these guys were either Democrats or, if you like, Hellenic loyalists. They didn't wish to be subjects of Persia, and they were going to do their damnedest to resist the Persian invasion. The other is that somehow or other, Leonidas was able to somewhat diminish the amount of assistance that Thebes could give to the Persians by inviting these loyalists and then using them as hostages, because they'd have relatives back in Thebes. And if the invasion were a failure, then Thebes afterwards would, the majority of they would look rather bad. And so that Leonidas would have this hold over Thebes following the Persian invasion. But of course, Leonidas himself was almost bound with his 300 to die. And so these 400 Thebans, if they were volunteers, would have, I think, expected also probably to die, as did, and this is not always made much of, or as much of as it should be, people from Thespiae in Boeotia, which was a subordinate city within Boeotia. Thebes was top dog in Boeotia, and so Thespiae was beneath it. The whole of the Thespian hoplite entity, so there were 700, this is a round number, all of them died at Thermopylae. It's not often remembered that it wasn't only the Spartans who died at Thermopylae. So there's a lot of Boeotian Boeotian politics, I think, going on. Quite clearly, those Thespians were volunteers, and they were patriots, and they were Hellenic loyalists.
So to kind of oversimplify that a little bit, would it be fair to say that the Thebans were viewing this from sort of all angles geographically, and the Spartans and the Athenians didn't have that same pressure because they were a bit further away?
Well, yes, they didn't have that pressure, but clearly Athens was the principal target as somewhere for the Persians to attack and, do real damage to. Because, now look at it from the other side. Why did Xerxes not satisfy himself with having the border where his father had left it at the Aegean Sea? Why invade mainland Greece at all? Well, Xerxes played the cards that the Battle of Marathon was something that still had to be accounted for, to be settled, to be restored. In other words, they'd lost that battle. The principal victor had been the Athenians, and the Athenians, moreover, and this is going further back, when there had been a revolt against Persia by Greeks of Asia within the Persian Empire in the 490s, the Athenians had sent ships and soldiers, and they'd actually burned one of the capitals, the regional capitals of the Persian Empire, including religious buildings. So the Persians were doing pretty much the same, using religious propaganda against the Greeks, as when Alexander went off many years later, he used religious propaganda. This is a revenge for sacrilege committed by the Persians. So there's a sort of ding dong. And the way it worked out was, of course, as we know, the Greeks unexpectedly won eventually the resisting Greeks after the Persians did massive damage twice, that is in 2 successive years, to Athens. They never got as far as the Peloponnese because of a battle called Battle of Salamis, a naval battle. Having won the Battle of Thermopylae, Xerxes piles through, his fleet comes down, they join up, just outside Athens. Big battle, Battle of Salamis, which the Persians lose. But the Persians had already destroyed much of the Acropolis and what's underneath the Acropolis in central Athens. And then they come back again the following year and destroy more even. So Athens really, really suffered, even though Athens with Sparta and their 30-odd allies. There are only about 32 or 33 Greek cities that actually resisted, as opposed to went over to the Persians or didn't fight at all. And so Athens really suffered. And then that's the explanation. It's a different conversation. Why was the Acropolis left as a ruin for 30 years after the Persians had withdrawn? And why was the Parthenon not built until the 440s rather than in the 470s, and so on and so on?
So, keeping with the theme of war, but shifting to mythology, because I want to touch on Theban mythology a bit. I think a lot of people are going to know that, as you were saying throughout this whole conversation, from the Athenian dramas. You mentioned Sophocles. Famously, we have Seven Against Thebes by Aeschylus as well, which is, I mean, to me at least, was like one of the most famous plays because it was one of the first ones I read at school. I presume other people know it from, know Thebes even, and Theban mythology from Oedipus, as you were saying as well. Now, I could be really fishing here, but a question I wanted to ask you, because if you sort of step back from history, there seems to be these like magical numbers in literature and in history itself. So if you look at the Romans from a totally different time period, it's 3 when it comes to military strategy. Because if you look at the Republic, they've got 3 Samnite wars, they've got 3 Carthaginian wars. There's always 3 of everything. If you go to then the Iliad, it seems to be the magical number of 4, which I know is an odd one, but for lots of people who don't know, it's always a repetition of 3. And on the 4th one, when a hero attacks somebody on a 4th try, they get up to like this daimon status, which is sort of like the superhuman like force infusing them. Now, when it comes to Thebes, 7 seems to be their magical number because they've got 7 gates. You've got 7 against Thebes. There's also rumors about other, sort of bands of 7 leading armies. I'm wondering if that is a magical number for the Thebans. Did I just look into that? And do we know why 7 was important to the Thebans?
We don't know why, but as you say, a lot of early Theban mythology, and one has to remember that though the sources that we have are Athenian by and large, they're of course borrowing what are originally Theban myths, which were put into poetry of the same sort as Homer, so epic hexameter poetry. But though there were 4 Theban epics about the dim, distant past, the great days of Theban history, none of them survives as such, and just bits and pieces of quotation. So that's one reason why we have such a poor surviving source database for Thebes. Why 7? It is a magical number in many, many cultures, so it's not peculiar to Thebes. 7 ages of man in Shakespeare. Each age in Roman, you talked about 3, but also 7. So, your first 7 years, then 14, 21, and up to 42 and so on. That's, again, something common to British culture, to Roman culture. The Theban 7s, the 2 that you mentioned, are just because, we haven't been able to document it archaeologically, but there is a certain agreement that Thebes in the historical period had 7 gates. And so that's projected backwards to when the walls were originally built. Zethos and Amphis are the alleged builders, and there's flute playing and all sorts of, there's a great mythology about the building of the walls, but it's because there are 7 gates. Already in Homer, as you'll know, in the Iliad, there is a reference to the 7 gates of Thebes, by contrast with, and this is quite surprising really, that a Greek poet should make this comparison to the advantage of a non-Greek city, which is that Thebes in Egypt, and this is very interesting and actually somewhat puzzling, has over 100 gates. goats. And so, 7, that's pretty pathetic. So in the Iliad, Thebes actually is not given the sort of build-up and projection that you would have expected from the archaeological evidence, from the epic evidence that hasn't survived. So there seems to be some sort of rivalry, I think, jealousy between epic traditions. Homer being the Iliad being an Eastern Greek thing, as opposed to a Theban, which is a mainland Greek thing. I think there's some sort of rivalry going on there. And why is it 7 against Thebes? Because, of course, Eteocles is one of Oedipus's 2 sons. Polynices is the other. Polynices goes into revolt against his brother. Where have we heard that before? And he goes off and he gets together 7 champions. And we think, I mean, this is poetic. Why did he choose 7? Because there are 7 gates. So each of the 7 brings an army, and each of them can attack a separate gate, which is, of course, the weakest point of the wall system of Thebes. So I'm not sure how magical that number would be. In other cultures, definitely it has that significance. It may be purely physical, physiological, that Thebes actually did have 7 gates.
So another question that might be me reaching, but again, I'm sitting with an expert, so this is the perfect scenario to be asking my reaching questions, because I'm sure somebody else has them somewhere. And there's a reason why these aren't commonly asked questions, because maybe there's nothing to them. But I recently reread the Aeneid, and this comes back to Thebes, I promise. But in the Aeneid, there is a character called Dido who comes from Tyre. She's obviously used to represent Cleopatra in a sort of Augustan propaganda way, and the enemy of Rome, and sort of establish that, right? So taking that aside, though, she comes from Tyre to run away from her brother and goes to North Africa. Now, I then, reading your book, wondered if this was stolen from Theban mythology by Virgil, because Cadmus is from Tyre as well, and he leaves Tyre, but to go in search of his sister. And then obviously, the oracles then like, never mind that, go and found this city. So I'm just wondering, because they're polar opposites, but they are very similar coming from the same place. Is there any evidence that Virgil took that and sort of switched that for the Aeneid, or is it not discussed because it's absolutely not linked whatsoever?
Well, there's a complication with the Aeneid, because where does Aeneas come from? He comes from Troy. But you're quite right. If you're interested in the foundation myth of Carthage, then the notion that the Tyrians founded it, I think that's probably correct. And Dido is invented, and she has another name, of course, as well in the Aeneid. So she is a complex character. But what you say about the Tyre, I think that's the common factor. And yes, it doesn't surprise me at all. For the Greeks, of course, the Phoenicians have a different connotation than they do for the Romans. And in the Greek case, it is their alphabet, their actual way of writing their Greek letters. They borrowed from one or other of the Phoenician cities. We don't actually know what the Phoenicians called themselves. It's very interesting. Our name, Phoenicians, is the Greek name for the people who inhabited what is today Lebanon, so Tyre, Sidon, and it literally means red men, red people, something to do also with the date palm, which in Greek is phoenix. So yes, I know I'm not against that notion at all, that the Roman myth might have borrowed, as very often they borrowed, because of course the very notion of Aeneas being the founder of Rome ultimately is grabbing the other side of the Trojan War myth. The Greeks go to Troy and capture it. They're the great conquerors, whereas Aeneas escapes in the Roman version, and he becomes the founder of Rome. So they're getting their slice of the originally entirely Greek mythology of Troy.
So keeping on the topic of epic poetry and mythology, one thing that's really interesting to me that you mentioned in this book, and that you've sort of touched on throughout this whole conversation, is the idea that there was this whole Theban cycle of epic poems that we don't have, unfortunately don't survive, but that one of them, at least one of them, I think, was about Oedipus specifically. Now, the reason why I found this so interesting is because I think a lot of the times we see Oedipus and Sophocles, that's the character, that's the story. He's a very tragic character. And so the idea that, maybe the Thebans flipped him, maybe the Athenians flipped him, who knows? But, this flipping of character from tragic character to epic hero is really fascinating. So I was wondering, I guess what I'm wondering is sort of, how do we know this? Because again, it doesn't survive. And what do we know? What's the extent of what we know about this, little part of the epic cycle?
Well, as I say, what we have are bits of quotation, sort of the odd line here and there. And then you have what are called Hellenistic, so post-classical critics, who are looking back at the entirety of surviving Greek literature. And of course, they would have had the originals. So you get summaries of the plot. And if you look at a modern collection of Theban fragments, it'll come with a lot of apparatus. That's to say, which sources quote which bits, which fragments, which surviving sources quote fragments from the non-extant poems, and what is the architecture surrounding the particular bit that does happen to be quoted. Why, in other words, did they quote that line and not others? So there's a quite useful collection done by Martin West, for example, and there are others. And that's how I actually didn't know a lot about this until I wrote my book, because you sort of, as you say, take for granted Oedipus through Sophocles. So what we don't really know is, though we know in other cases, how Sophocles, and of course Euripides, the Bacchae, and Aeschylus, you mentioned, the Seven Against Thebes, how did they select? What did they select from? What was the original, the total picture of the royal family at Thebes? And it has, well, literally a tragic, of course, dimension, because Oedipus kills his natural father, not realizing that he was at all related to him. So one thing is, why did the Thebans invent such tragic stories about their family, their royal family in the distant past? And that's a question. I mean, did in the original Theban epic, Pentheus, or king, he's the, I think, great nephew of Cadmos, the founder, his mother, according to Euripides' version, ripped him to shreds, tore his head off under the delusion that he was a wild animal, because she was drunk. She was blind drunk because of Dionysus, who himself, of course, is half Theban, as is Heracles. Is that part of the original Theban invented myth? It's not impossible, but it's quite gory and nasty, as opposed to heroic. And so it's possible the Thebans' own mentality, their own sort of projection backwards of their royalty, in itself, I think it's unique that Thebes was, in myth, founded by a non-Greek. I don't think there's another Greek city which has a mythology, a founding mythology, whereby the founder is a non-Greek. So there is something odd about Thebes and its mythology intrinsically, whatever the Athenian dramatists made of it. And Pindar, unfortunately, though a Theban, or adopted Theban at any rate, he doesn't shed light on that sort of issue. He rehearses great screeds of mythology regarding just about every character that he sings a praise song for. And there are a few Thebans, only a few actually, but he doesn't give us that sort of detailed ancient Theban mythography that we would ideally like.
Okay, so I have one more question, which is keeping on the topic of deities, but it's going more so back to history. And it's, again, as I did with my last chat, I have the page number, which is page 51, if you guys want to go and look at it. And on page 51, you did a really interesting thing in discussing Thebes' patron deity, because as you said, Dionysus, he's from this whole, mythological Theban even family.
is Theban, Semele, yeah.
Yes, and she's the daughter of Cadmus. So, it's all sort of linking back to this incredible founding story. You would assume that Dionysus would be 100% be-all, end-all patron deity of Thebes. And even though, yes, he is the patron deity of Thebes, you mentioned that sometimes that switches in and out. So there is record of Poseidon at one point, and there's also record of Demeter at one point being the patron deity. And that's why on the cult statue that it doesn't have any like defining features on it, so that way I presume they can sort of pray to it as the patron deity. So my question is why? Because this sort of seems, at least to me, coming from Sparta, whose patron deity is Athena, as well as Athens' patron deity of Athena, you have one that you stick with, and here they move around.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? I mean, again, suggests Thebes is slightly unusual in its attitude to patron deities. But you mentioned Demeter. I'm not sure that she would have counted as a polyadic, as we say, goddess. But Poseidon at Onkistos, which is the shrine where all Boeotian people who speak Boeotian Greek, who worship in a Boeotian way, who have a visual repertoire, and because Thebes is Boeotian, it includes all that Theban mythology. Well, at Onkistos was celebrated every year the all Boeotian festival, the Pamboiotia. And the patron god, the god of Onkistos, was Poseidon. So in that sense, the Thebans, being Boeotians, would have recognized Poseidon as their patron goddess. But as a city god, you mentioned Dionysus. The other one is Heracles. And you have to remember that though Hercules is half mortal, half divine, his dad is, of course, Zeus, but his mum is a mortal. He is a hero, therefore, in technical terms, through his labors, his 12 labors, performed for a king down in the Peloponnese. He was therefore deemed so heroic, he was elevated from the status of hero to that of fully god. And it's as such that he is the ancestor we talked about before of the Macedonian royal family and of the Spartan too royal family. So Thebes in that regard is, if you like, more orthodox. But thank you for bringing out lots and lots of details, which, looking back, I would write the book differently. I would make more of some things. I certainly would want to add things which I've discovered afterwards.
Unfortunately, that does now conclude all the time that we have. I must leave you to go about your very busy day, and I do hugely appreciate, Professor Cartledge, all the time that you take to sit down and to chat with me through your books, through studies, through areas of ancient Greece that I'm not familiar with. I cannot even express properly how much I appreciate this. So thank you very much. And also, of course, thank you guys for watching the videos, for engaging with the videos, leaving comments, liking, subscribing. That means the absolute world to me. And it goes without saying that you guys can find Thebes by Professor Paul Cartledge linked in the description below. And I've also linked the chat that we did about Sparta, as well as the Spartan books as well. So you guys can find everything basically in the description below. But thank you guys so much for tuning in, and we'll be seeing you next time with more videos here on Moan Inc. So I'll see you guys then.